So our discussion is about discourse analysis and framing. This was, in essence, a response, a yes to a call by Goffman, a sociologist. He called upon the linguists to join the effort of exploring and examining framing and discourse. So in that sense, this book is a fabulous collection of discourse-based analyses of different speech events and speech contexts, rather than basically covering everything. As you will see, it would cover some areas. Every chapter primarily begins with definitions and the ways in which different disciplines approach the topic. The relation between frame analysis and discourse analysis is also analyzed, particularly in the first chapter. We will also be looking at discourse analysis within the context of cultural variations in connection with the Per film, which is a silent film developed by William Chafe. So every discourse, according to Jacques Derrida, even a poetic or oracular sentence carries with it a system of rules for producing analogous things, meaning parallel or comparable things, and thus an outline of methodology. So this is very important, that definitely discourse not only offers a framework for analysis, but discourse itself is an analytical, basically, tool, a theoretical tool itself. So how do we define discourse analysis? Analysis of language or extended discourse. Anything beyond the sentence would be considered discourse in the context of discourse. So contrary to formal linguistics that deals with decontextualized text, language and formal elements of grammar or discrete units such as morphemes, phonemes, semantics, syntax, discourse analysis. Discourse analysis, as opposed to text analysis, looks at discourse in context. It is really the context which shapes the webs of meanings and interpretations. So DA, short for discourse analysis, can be written or spoken. It could be oral or oral. And one could even argue that it could be taking other forms as well. For instance, it could be visual in essence. It is different from text linguistics in the sense that discourse is more interactive. It deals with spoken language and communication, whereas text analysis deals with mostly the written language or text. However, increasingly, some use text and discourse synonymously. And what they have in common is obviously language. Language is a resource. So discourse analysis has grown. It is wide and varied. It covers, among others, conversation analysis, genre analysis, pragmatics, text linguistics, interactional linguistics, sociolinguistics, critical discourse, ethnography, and many examples can be found, such as teacher-student interactions, patient-doctor encounters, teasing among friends, cross-cultural communication, sermons of men and women, adult-child interactions, political discourse, and newspaper articles. Now, Tannen familiarizes you with quite a few of those speech events in the context of discourse analysis. So by understanding the way language is used in context, we can understand the social function or speech acts or roles and identities. So frame analysis, in a way, could be defined as a form of discourse. It deals with the type of activities that the participants engage in. And not only that, but what they think basically they are doing by talking the way they do. Different disciplines may use different terminology. For instance, script is used as a causal chain that represents knowledge about frequently experienced events, such as going to a restaurant. There is basically a routine. There is a script, what it entails to go to a restaurant. And a frame, which really comes from more linguistic, it is based on linguistic choices. It is associated with prototypical situations in which we find ourselves, such as buying and selling. For instance, buying would involve a buyer, a seller, and then the means of exchange, for instance, in this case, money. And obviously, if you have selling, you would still have the same basic components, but the relations would change. In anthropology, frame analysis is traceable to Bateson, and he argued that no communicative act, both verbal and nonverbal, could be understood without signals or what he called meta communicative messages. So meta communicative messages are messages really about messages and how those messages are to be interpreted. And linguistic anthropology, Heim, the most prominent basically figure, frames are used as means of speaking. And for Gomperez, frames are contextualization cues that signal speech activity as a type of frame, as a unit of analysis. Another term that you would come across throughout Tannen's textbook is schema. These are knowledge structures, categories, or concepts of knowledge, understanding. So these are an ensemble of prototypical features or categories or structures that we store in our memory, and they are to be retrieved as bodies of knowledge, for instance, in the future or when the occasion arises. So schemas refer to what Tannen, borrowing from Ross, calls expectations about people, objects, events, and settings in the world. And this is Tannen's favorable, basically, definition of framing expectations. Now, Goffman, who follows a more sociological orientation, defines basically frames as such. I assume the definitions of a situation are built up in accordance with principles of organization which govern events and our subjective involvement in them. Frame is the word I use to refer to such of these basic elements as I am able to identify. So you're going to come across Goffman frequently throughout the textbook, and it is important that you familiarize yourself with what he thinks. He examined the use of frames in institutions in terms of frame elements and events as conceptual or cognitive views or situations and activities. So for Goffman, our thinking really occurs only through frames. So that is how thinking could be defined. Now, in terms of interactive frames, according to Goffman, when we change the frame, we change the so-called footing. Footing is a change in the alignments or in the production and reception of an utterance. So for instance, when was it Johnny who accepted to be a volunteer to create the Google anonymous phone for us, he really showed through his interactive frame a change in footing. He aligned basically with me by accepting to do the work. Maybe some people, even without knowing, declined or were not really willing, but through visible and invisible embodied actions, we could basically see that they were not aligning with my particular request. So we do that every day in life. Now, it is quite interesting, how footing can be demonstrated through Zoom. Definitely every mechanism, digital or otherwise, contains ways in which through these channels, we could express our footing, our alignment or non-alignment with the participants in a conversation. I would say that, for instance, when it comes to students collaborating with one another, expressing their alignment with one another, breakout rooms would be a more conducive environment to expressing basically alignments rather than the main floor, which is totally controlled by the instructor. So anyway, keep in mind that that is what footing is. So a change in footing, according to Goffman, then is a change in frame. And footing is really expression of alignment or non-alignment. You can stop me anytime, by the way, if you have a question. So the change, as I was saying, is linguistically, paralinguistically marked. It is also embodied because you could show your alignment or non-alignment through embodied actions, through your body orientation. Or you could show that through the tone of your voice, or you could show that through word choice or the utterance or the sentence structure that you use. So that's why the change is linguistically, paralinguistically marked. It is also marked through gestures. We cannot ignore that. It could be marked through eye gaze, for instance, as well, or it could be a constellation of all these actually factors. So different identities, according to Goffman, can be invoked by the same speaker, author, principal, animator, or figure. So for instance, a typical example would be the White House spokesperson. So let me ask you this question. Is the White House spokesperson, when they have a conference, is he or she the author of the message which is delivered? Is this a change in footing, or no comments. Now, obviously, he is not the author, because if it comes from the White House, somebody else basically wrote that message. Principal is someone who is responsible for the message. Is he responsible for the message? Now, obviously, he is not responsible for the message because the message comes, let's say, from the White House, from that institution. Is he the animator? I would say, or rather, Goffman would say, yes, he is or she is the animator. The animator is the voice box, if you will, the vocal bands. And is he a figure? Any kind of basically conference or press conference is really a theatrical performance. So the White House spokesperson, for instance, would occupy such a role as a theatrical really figure. So as you could see, it is the same speaker, but the same speaker does not occupy all these roles. So he or she is not the author, not the principal, but is the animator and just a theatrical, basically, figure. So we arrive at meaning at the intersection of text and context. Obviously, you cannot take a text out of context or it becomes nonsensical. Frames are interactive by virtue of the linguistic patterns which we use to create meanings. And this is done through contextualization cues, as you will see throughout the different chapters, and discourse, basically, markers. Tannen defines frames as structures of expectations. So they would include both knowledge schema and also the interactive frames. So frame analysis could be summarized as follows: the way we think, the way we make sense of things, the way we interpret things, the way we do things, the context, basically the way in which the context defines a situation, the way we know boundaries. And a classic example is Orson Welles' The War of Worlds. It was the Public Panic, a radio program that, people who didn't know that it was a radio show panicked because they thought that Martians had attacked the Earth. So there was a public, basically, panic. So to summarize, in a way, frames are cognitive, knowledge, specific schemas, interaction frames, and linguistic resources all play an active role in constituting and being constitutive of discourse. So we are using the word here, discourse, as the tricky, basically, part. It really applies to both written and spoken discourse. It is both verbal and non-verbal aspects of communication. That is what discourse is. You have to be careful not to think of discourse as spoken language only. So framing in discourse shows how discourse and frames are constructed in different contexts, as shown by Tannen and her contributors between, for instance, the first one is between a pediatrician, a mother and child, and then the psychotic patient, and a psychiatrist and a patient, the Japanese and American discussion groups, children and sportscasting, women and sermons, teasing among friends, and speaking for another, or sociolinguistic interviews. So those are the titles of the different chapters in the book. So if we wanted, for instance, to look at frame analysis in the context of the first chapter, it really deals with the degree of formality and informality and the ways in which register would shape and determine footing in the context of the first chapter. Obviously, culture is definitely a very important part in this process. So let's see if this runs. Watch the video and we will have a general discussion. I may ask some of you to tell me, or I may actually have you in breakout rooms telling one another about basically what you saw. And it would be interesting to see what details you captured and how you recall and retell and things that were, for instance, deleted, or you found things that caught your attention more than somebody else's. Do you see the screen?
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, you see the movie screen, the per film?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to create 4 breakout rooms. You just saw the pair film developed by William Chave. Take turns, basically, a couple of you could tell what you saw. And then we will come back to the main floor to discuss basically your observations about different ways of telling, things that stood out, things that were deleted, things that were added, so on and so forth. Ready to go? Okay, 4 groups. Okay. So every basically room had comparable and sometimes contrastive interpretations of what they saw. Anything interesting that struck you in your basically retelling or somebody else's retelling of the pair? Come on, earn your participation points. By the way, I did check the discussion board. Those forums are already on the discussion board for frame analysis, all the chapters.
Wait,
They have already been created under.
are you talking about the study guides?
Not the study guides, basically where you could enter a commentary about the second part of the course.
How many discussions do I have to make?
I don't have to create a new one. So anyway, my question was, if you had anything interesting to say about the pair film and the various interpretations that you had and recalling and retelling.
So, was it symbolic of the boy looking at the man eating the pears?
What?
Did you hear me?
No. Yeah, you're
Partially.
Partially. I said, was it symbolic of the boy staring at the man with the pears? My teacher. Oh, no. Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
No, you're being cut off.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
No.
Is it still breaking off?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
You are breaking off here.
Okay, let me type it in.
Okay. So as she is typing it in, anyone else had any observations?
But just like we were talking about in our room, how we all kind of like thought the animal was a different animal.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, Marissa had seen it as a mule, someone else as a dog. And I would say that most of us saw a goat, isn't that right?
Oh, you're stuck with the mule.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I thought it was a donkey.
I thought it was a
Oh.
goat.
See?
Donkey, close to a mule.
Pretty much.
Mule is neither a donkey
It's
nor
half a mule, okay? I mean, the mule is half of a donkey anyway, so.
My group talked about how the kid stole the pears and how that
Mhm.
further effect throughout the other part of the video.
Right. It was not only telling, but also assessing or judging in a way what was going on. Evaluation becomes basically central to the telling. So Curly says the boy is staring at the man with the pears. So this story, in a way, has been really used with members of different cultures. Tannen compared Americans and the Greeks and their rendition of the story. So in conventions of movie commentary, cinematic jargon, and technical aspects, that are associated with the American basically telling, we could see a need for rich or thick basically descriptions, whereas in the Greek version during that time, more an oral basically culture and tradition. It was more broad, and definitely the descriptions were more poetic, and the language was more non-specific. So Americans who were used to written reviews, and this is a part of the rhetoric of the culture, talking about movies, they saw this as a genre of a movie or a movie of some sort. So the contrast between the formal and oral informal traditions of family and group members would be something that was noted. Greeks used strategies that are more associated. By the way, do you see my screen?
No, we don't.
No, not your screen.
No.
How come you did not stop me? Let me just bring this back. Do you see it now?
Yes.
Yes.
So again, Tannen basically compared the Greeks and Americans. Americans basically looked at this as a movie genre, and within the movie genre, the kind of language or rhetoric that they were using dealt with stylistically their basically cultural expectations from a movie and how a movie should be. Whereas the Greeks, at least during that time, belonging to more an oral tradition, had a more broad, poetic, and non-specific basically approach or language towards the parafilm. Americans were more conscious, probably we are still more conscious of technology, and because of the fact that they were more of a written culture, their approach to the movie was definitely more inclined to be in line with formal, really, traditions. The Greeks used strategies that were more associated with conventionalized forms of discourse. For Americans, it was more the literate, basically, traditions of schooling. Americans and Western societies, according to Gomperis, follow conventional rhetorical strategies for oral use. The Greeks do not use direct mention of or allusion to the film. It was given for them. So they didn't have to specify this was, this particular genre. They try to make it more interesting by reconstructing the characters' thoughts, by reconstructing the emotions. Americans were more preoccupied with accuracy of details. Someone mentioned they were just trying to figure out what the color of the shirt of the boy, for instance, was. So this need for explicitness, directness, and also specific details and vivid descriptions is more an American really quality. American descriptions were more elaborate as opposed to the Greeks. These differences, rather than being differences in cognitive processes, are functional cognitive systems which may vary across different cultures. So differences were also apparent in the ways of in which basically we talk about interactions or impressions that we get when we listen to other. Now, obviously, if we come from different cultural expectations, these differences could lead to miscommunication and misunderstanding. Obviously, we have to be very careful not to stereotype Greeks as basically romantic or irrational, and Americans as cold and lacking in human feeling, that they are more interested in description, so on and so forth. There's always that danger. So the main thing, takeaway from this is we use linguistic resources to reveal those expectations, the frames, the scripts, the schemas, as each group would use different categories to structure or organize their frames or the events that they saw. Tannen, interestingly, found basically groups of people watched the video, and then after a while they rewatched it and they told about what they had seen. And these are her observations. They had used a wide spectrum of linguistic resources, but characterized by omissions. Certain things were totally omitted, certain things were repeated. False starts were integral to the telling process, backtracking. And this is something that you probably noticed in your own retelling. Hedges, going from room to room, I could see, this was going on. And negatives, contrastive, connectives, modals, inexact statements, generalizations, inferences, evaluative language, interpretation, moral judgment, incorrect statement, addition. All these things were identified as being used in different, basically, types of telling. Rather than all of these to be present, but they were found to be present in multiple, basically, tellings of the Paris story by Americans and by the Greeks. So that is the Paris story. For those of you who may be interested in basically experimenting with this, for the second paper, it may offer an opportunity, particularly if you pick a culture that has not been studied, to see, what you could do a cross-cultural comparison. You could have a group of people, members of one culture, to watch the movie and then to tell you. And obviously it is important that you record, at least audio record their telling, to be able to transcribe them. and then to see how their retelling, for instance, compared with another group would be different. A group that has been written about, for instance, if you didn't want to do it on two different, for instance, groups. Any questions?
Morgan, you don't read that.
Hmm. What is the second paper about? I'm sorry. The second paper? Hello? What is the second paper about? Yes.
Second paper. I mean, yeah, this could
Mhm.
be potentially the topic for a second paper for some of you who might be interested in this topic.
Okay. So are there any other topic options or is this it?
Yeah, of course. So those
Okay.
options you can find basically under guidelines for the second paper.
Okay. Thank you.
Uh,
Wait,
I'm still listening.
take her to a nursing home?
Under guidelines?
Okay, so I have a difficult time, Kelly, understanding what you're saying because you're constantly breaking off.
I said you were talking about the topics under the guideline.
So if you go to, let me stop basically the recording because
The person that she talked to